The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Travis McGrath. I'm the Director of Client Services here at Exago, and thanks for joining us on today's support lab. Just to make sure we're all able to see my screen and you guys can hear me, if you could type yes or loud and clear. I see a couple of the folks who have been on many of these labs in the past have already done so. Always great to have you guys back. So today's topic, we're going to be talking about joins. We're going to be focusing on joins from a front-end perspective. So this is going to be a pretty basic, short, fundamental lab. And then in our technical lab later in the month, we're going to go into the deep, more back-end API database kind of topics around joins. So here we're really going to cover some of the fundamentals. So to start with, we'll just run through the agenda. And for folks who haven't been on the labs before, if at any point you have any questions or you want me to back up, go over something again, go into more detail, please feel free to use that question panel in the bottom right as a way to do that. Great. So today's overview, we're going to answer the question of what are joins. If you're not a DBA, if you haven't done a lot of database work, we're going to give you some fundamentals here. We're going to talk about the types of joins and why they matter when you're writing reports. So going beyond that, we're going to just dive right into our topic. So what are joins? So in Exago, we're going to have data objects. We'll talk about what those might look like in just a moment. And a join is just a relationship between those data objects. Now that's a little abstract, so what we're going to do is we're going to have an example. And on here, we're going to start with our samples today are going to use a fictitious university data. So think professors, students, classes, grades, things like that. And particularly for our first join, we're going to think of how professors and students relate to each other directly. And so we're going to start with the example that each professor advise some number of students. They have a professor as a dedicated advisor. Beyond that, we'll look at a case where students can enroll in classes, and then we can go a step further and look at how professors teach classes as well. But our first example here, and most of what we're going to talk about today, is the case where professors advise students. So to show what that looks like, our data objects, if you're familiar with BI and databases, these will be tables. If you're not familiar with that, think of these as different worksheets in an Excel workbook, right? They're just columns of data, and they list information. So for our professors, we have their name, their position, their department, and for students, we have their name, their major, and you'll notice this column here that says their advisor. And this advisor column is going to be the ID of the professor. So here, Ted Stitch from the chemistry department is the advisor for Beth, who's a chemistry major, right? And so we say that something's joined, or we join these two tables by matching up those particular columns. So you can tell that a professor advises a student if the professor's ID matches the student's ID. So just want to pause there, see if there are any initial questions. Great. So that's a basic join. So we might want to think about, well, what types of joins are there? And regularly we talk about 4 types of joins. So we talk about inner, left outer, right outer, and full outer. And that might not give you a lot of inclination for what that means. But what we can think about is the relationship between those two objects, those two data sets, and what we want to include or exclude. So an inner join is to say that we're going to join those two objects, we're going to define this relationship, but we only want to look at professors who advise students and students that have advisors. Maybe somebody is still, in their first year, they don't know what their major is, so they don't have an advisor, or they're switching advisors and there's some period where they don't have one. We don't want to, for an inner join, we don't want to include those, and we don't want to include any professors who don't advise students, right? So we can see here you have a mapping, and each professor has at least one student. Maybe they advise more, but each student definitely has an advisor as well. So a left outer join is when you include all the professors. So for example, in this case, Professor Hawker doesn't advise any students, but we still want to include that in our data set. So that's a left outer join, and we say left because if you think of going from professors to students, we're including the professors, so that's the left side of that join. We're including all professors. Similarly, on a right outer join, you have only the professors who advise students, but all students whether or not they have an advisor. So you can see actually I'm in this data set, so I don't have an advisor for whatever reason, but then we have the students who do down below there. And then a full outer join, as you might guess, is all students and all professors. So whether or not the students have an advisor, whether the professor advises any students, and then professors and students who do have advisors, right? So these are our 4 types of joins. And that should give us sort of a base understanding of what joins are, being a relationship between 2 data objects, and the different types of joins. So again, I want to pause here and just take a moment to see if there are any questions. Okay, great. Pretty fundamental stuff. No immediate questions there. So you might ask yourself, what does this all mean in Exago, right? You might say, why did I just learn that? Why do I care? And that's a great question. And the answer is a little funny. From a report writing perspective, it doesn't. You don't really need to know this. And this is one of the fundamental parts of the Exago interface, is that as we write reports, the joins have already been set up for us. And we can write express views, we can build visualizations on dashboards, we can even build advanced reports without having too much knowledge of the technical behind the scenes joins. Sort of. If we want to, we can go a little deeper. And so what we can do here is when we're writing reports, we'll notice that things are handled automatically. But if we want to, we can go in for advanced reports and make some changes. So that's what we're going to show here. So I'm going to jump over to a local copy of my Exago installation. And the first thing I'm going to do is just build a very simple Express view. And I'll notice I have all my data on the left, just like normal. And in this case, I have my data objects. They're sorted into folders. And we talked about this in one of our advanced labs before, but the same data objects may appear more than once in one place based on the model of how those joins are related. If you see something like this in your environment, that's great. If not, no problem. Your administrator just may not have set that up in the same way. So in this case, if I want to, I can drag over my professor. If we're at a formal setting, so I'll drag over their last name, and then I can drag over the first name of the student that they advise and what major that student is. And if I want to, of course, because we're in Express views, I can do some simple grouping. Now, what you'll notice here is that in an Express view, the join, that relationship between those two, is just taken care of for me. I don't have to worry about it. And in fact, in this case, I noticed that for this professor, that there's some blank professor information. So what that means is there's some students who don't have professors. This is an outer join. But Express views as a data discovery mechanism aren't really meant for modifying joins or doing any of that advanced work. So in Express views, all you have to think about for joins is maybe there are different join models in the data that you have available. But if not, it just means everything's handled for you. You don't have to worry about the joins here. I'm going to jump over to an example. Here we have an advanced report. It's pretty simple. It just has a report header, a detail section showing us our professor's name and our student names. Again, which students they're advising. And you can see, if I go to my categories menu, you can see that the other place joins have a big impact is that some data objects are grayed out. And so when I select categories or data objects from my categories menu or the categories tab of the new report wizard, as I do that, other things are grayed out. And what gets grayed out is based on that join logic that's been set up by our administrators ahead of time. So I want to pause there and just make sure there are no other questions. There was a great question. So one came in and said, when defining data objects, is there any reason to use a right outer join? Why or why not? So a couple of things here. So in terms of defining data objects and joins, there's going to be a lot more detail on how that's done from an admin side in our support lab on the 20th when we do the technical join session. But if you're setting up the joins either as an admin, or even we'll show this in a second, we can modify the type of joins here in the Advanced Report Designer. There may be a reason you want to use a right join if you wanted to include specifically, in this case, maybe students who didn't have advisors, but for the purpose of this report, maybe you don't care about professors who aren't advising students, right? So it's really about what data set you're after and what kind of questions you want to answer. Awesome. Okay, so we have this report, and it runs very simply. I can run it, and looking at this setup, it looks like it's an inner join, right? I don't see any professors without students, and I don't see any students without advisors. So what if I saw this report and I ran it and I said, oh, okay, cool. My administrator set this up so it's an inner join, but for the purpose of this report, I want to see all the professors, whether or not they have students. There's still a way you can accomplish this. So in the Advanced Report Designer, I can go to the options dropdown here, and if enabled, and it may not be in your environment, if enabled, I'll have this Advanced Joins menu. So if I go to Advanced, there's the Joins menu. And what this will do is it'll show us all the joins used to relate all of the data objects on the report. In this case, there are just two. So to relate two objects, we just have a single join. And it'll give us a sort of verbose way of describing inner, outer, left outer, right outer joins. And that is to say, it'll give us this prompt and it'll say, in addition to professor data that has matching students, that is to say, in addition to the inner join, include, and then I can use these checkboxes to change that join type to a left outer or a right outer or a full outer join. So just to show that, I'm going to go through and do the other three cases here. So we've already run it with both checkboxes undone, and that was an inner join. But if I want to, I can show all the professors whether or not they have student data. So if I check that box, click OK, and run the report, you'll notice that I get our professor here who isn't advising any students. Maybe they're on leave or they're working on a dissertation or something. And then I can come back into our Advanced Joins menu. I can do the opposite. I can select just students that don't have professor data. And so in this case, I'll see our students who don't have advisors. And of course, I can go and set it to be a full join as well, full outer join, so I can see all the professors and all the students. Right, so there's our advisor with students, here's our professor with no advisees, and then here's all our students who are paired. Great question came in. So you'll notice here in this case, we have this comma because I'm concatenating the professor's first and last name. And the question is, could we suppress that comma? And the answer is absolutely. So in here, we could modify our formula. I'll just take a brief aside to show a formula here. And what we could say is, if the professor's last name is blank, then show blank. Otherwise, show the professor's first and last name. Yeah, so we could absolutely use a formula here to account for students that don't have professors and make sure that's blank. And we could do the same thing on the student column as well. Awesome. So for a simple report, when there are only two data objects and only one join, it's a pretty simple thing to do, right? We can see the join here. But we may have a more complex report. So here, I've got a report. It's still showing professors and student data, but I've also added classes. Now, in this setup, the professors have a teaches column, and that points to the class they're teaching. I don't know why, but in this case, we only have one class taught by a professor in maybe a given semester. Right? And I can see where that relationship comes from. If I go to the Advanced Joins menu, I'll notice that I have professor data that has matching classes. And if enabled, again, you may not see this as an option, I can edit that join, and I can even see what columns match up. So in this case, my professor teaches is one column, and we're matching that to the ID of the class that they're teaching. And in this report, you'll see one additional thing. So in the case where we have two joins from the same object to two unrelated objects, so in this case we have professors advising students and we have professors teaching classes, we end up with something called a Cartesian product. Now, we won't go in depth on what those are, but in the case that we have one of these, we'll also get an additional option in our Advanced Joins menu that lets us force there to be some subset of data. And that is to say, in this case, before I use this option, I'm just going to run the report. And I'll notice that I get each professor, and this professor doesn't have any courses, and this professor, as we saw earlier, doesn't have any students. But for the purpose of this report, again, I can set it to say I want to make sure a professor has coursework, or vice versa. I want to make sure a professor has students. So I can use this joins menu, and I can use that additional option here to say only show for a professor to have any of the following. They must have, in this case, I could say classes. And you'll notice that if we jump back and forth, Professor Guerra, who's not teaching any classes, is excluded from the report. So we can force that relationship to exist. So a great question came in. Could you do a negative relationship? Could you say, show me only the professors who don't have any students? To do that, we would simply change our type of join, as we showed here, right? So we'd say professors that do not have students. We'd make sure it's a left join. And then we'd probably add a filter and just filter where the student name is blank, the student ID is blank. And that would show us only the professors who don't have students. That's a great question, by the way. So in terms of prepared content, that's really it. Joins by design are really simple in Exago. For the most part, if you're using express views, they're just handled for you. You don't have to worry about them. You also, when you're using the categories menu, it will handle graying out objects that are unrelated to make sure that there's always a relationship between the data on your report. And again, that just happens for you automatically. But if you want to, you can go in and use this Advanced Joins menu to include additional information, or maybe you have an outer join by default and you want to limit some information. You can do that as well. And you can use this to see and understand the relationship between your data objects as well. You'll notice, for example, if I hover over a join, it tells me what columns are being matched up as well. So in terms of joins, that's really what we have today for you. So what I'm going to do here is just give a shout out that our next lab is on the 20th of this month, and it's going to be joins for Exago admins. In that lab, we're going to go into more detail. We're going to go into some technical pieces, may even touch on the API. My colleague Nick Cortina, who has given many of the labs in the past, is going to present that one. Pretty exciting to hear what he's got in store. And beyond that, as always, at the end of the lab today, when you close out of the webinar, there will be a survey. In that survey, please let us know what topics you want us to cover, right? What do you want to hear? What topics do you want examples of in more detail? We're always looking for lab topics. This one actually came out of a request from that survey. So please take the 60 seconds to fill that out. Give us an idea if you have a topic in mind. Okay, so there was one request before I send everyone off. There was one request on how to remove that comma in the case of a blank report, just to show that again. So in this case, we have a report. In our join, we set it to be a full outer, or maybe in this case, just a left outer. But we're going to have some professors who, I'm going to set it to be a full outer just to be sure. We're going to have some professors who are blank on this report. And we don't want a pesky sort of comma just hanging out here. So we want to be able to remove that. So what we can do is in this field, we have our formula editor. And instead of just concatenating together the professor's first and last name with a comma, like we did here, we can use an if condition. We can say if the professor's name or ID is blank, then show just blank, right? Make sure it's just blank. Otherwise, show the professor's first and last name with that comma separated. Awesome. So with that, please make sure to attend the lab on the 20th. That's where we'll be going into more deep dive on the topic. But I'll just say thanks for attending today's lab and happy reporting.